Hello, Garland Nixon here with Dr. Gerald Horne. There is a very dangerous conflict going on in the Middle East. We're hoping that it does not metastasize, and we're going to talk about it with Dr. Horne. He's a historian, he's a researcher, and much, much more. Let's talk. Hello, dear friends. Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author of upwards of 30 books. He's a historian, a researcher, and a friend of the show. Dr. Horne, welcome back to my humble YouTube show.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's talk about the conflict. Lots to talk about in the conflict in the Middle East. But let me ask you this: for those who don't know the history of this, if we could start off with what you consider are the important nodes in this historical timeline that got us to where we are today, Dr. Horne.
Well, briefly, let's start in the late 19th century. That is to say, when the idea of Zionism as a philosophy and a political project arose under the guidance of Theodor Herzl, the idea was that anti-Jewish fervor could not be eradicated, and therefore Jewish people needed a state of their own for their own protection. However, the events post-October 7th suggest that that premise has been challenged severely, since the ingathering of the Jewish community disproportionately in one site, speaking of Israel, in a sense makes them easier to attack. But in any case, what happens is that at the end of World War I, 1918, 1919, Turkey, now Turkey, which had been the colonial force in historic Palestine for hundreds of years leading up to that point. It was on the losing end. During World War I, Britain takes over. The Balfour Declaration emerges, where a deal is cut promising the Jewish people a homeland in historic Palestine, although, of course, obviously, London did not consult the non-Jewish population of historic Palestine. In any case, the relationship between London and the Zionists rapidly deteriorated to the point where, on the verge of the establishment of the State of Israel 75 odd years ago, there were terrorist attacks by the Zionist gangsters on British interests. That leads, of course, to the formation of the State of Israel, 1947, 1948, which leads to a dispossession of the Arab community. Recall what's happening as we speak when the Israelis are demanding that Arabs in Gaza evacuate, leave. Many are afraid because they feel that if they do leave, they'll never be allowed to come back. That's what happened in 1947, 1948. In any case, since 1947, 1948, there has been a steady dispossession of the Palestinian community. It's revealed in the fact that in the so-called settlements that are being constructed on the West Bank, of course, historic Palestine now consists of Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. The settlements increasingly are being built on the West Bank because the Israelis were forced out of Gaza some years ago. And many of these settlements are being occupied by people from Brooklyn, for example. It's no accident that a significant number of U.S. nationals or dual Israeli-U.S. nationals are now being detained, or as they say in the United States, held hostage by the Hamas forces. And in any case, a number of U.S. Israeli dual nationals were killed. Now, the Israelis are telling us as we speak, to come to the post-October 7th moment, that they are eager to invade Gaza and give a whipping to Hamas. But in the meantime, they do what they're best at, which is dropping bombs from 30,000 feet. I'm not so sure if Israel is eager, as they tell us, to invade Gaza, because they are not very good, like most standing armies, in urban warfare. You got a taste of that in what befell them in Lebanon in 2006, where Hezbollah, the militia group said to be in this country a proxy of Iran, just like Hamas is said to be a proxy of Iran. Hezbollah gave them a real pasting. And Hezbollah, of course, as we know today, has more rockets in its arsenal than Hamas does. So Israel faces the prospect that if they do invade Gaza, which they're promising to do, they'll open a two-front war because Hezbollah intermittently has been shooting rockets into northern Israel since October 7th. But in any case, I'm not so sure they're eager to invade Gaza, because not only will they confront urban warfare, which is not easy for any standing army, but they'll also have to confront snipers, booby traps, minefields, drones with grenades dropped out of the drones, which did enormous damage post October 7th against the Israeli forces. So Israel, as they say on the streets, might be just selling wolf tickets. The problem is that if you're a bully and you can't back up your rhetoric, you're quickly exposed. And that's one of the reasons why we see a U.S. naval flotilla off the coast of Israel as we speak. Watch out for some sort of false flag operation whereby the Israelis fabricate an attack on these U.S. ships. Actually, they in fact, in the Six-Day War of 1967, they did attack the USS Liberty, but for different reasons. But to fast forward to today, do not be surprised if there is a false flag operation where the Israelis are able to blame the Iranians for attacking this ship, which will give the United States an excuse to do what they've longed to do for some years now, which is destabilize the Islamic Republic of Iran. But in any case, I think that this crisis in Israel is also a crisis for U.S. imperialism, which is highly appropriate because over the years, the Zionists and the Israelis and the Zionist lobby here in the United States have done quite a bit of dirty work for U.S. imperialism. Recall some decades ago when they destabilized the presidential campaign of Jesse Jackson by branding him a bigot and anti-Semite. They did the same trick just recently against Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader in Great Britain. And now we have Keir Starmer, or Sir Keir Starmer, excuse me, replacing Jeremy Corbyn. And he's been quiet as a church mouse with regard to this crisis and conflict, unlike the people in the streets of London. And then there was the ludicrously obscene campaign that portrayed the then Soviet Union as sort of an heir to Nazi Germany. And so therefore, there had to be a campaign to liberate Soviet Jewry. Sadly, tragically, unfortunately, David Dinkins, the first Black mayor of New York City, was a leader of that campaign. Of course, he helped to set the table for the current sellout policies on this crisis by his successor, speaking of the former cop Mayor Eric Adams of New York City, not to mention the Speaker in waiting of the U.S. House of Representatives, Hakeem Jeffries, who also represents a predominantly Black district and is doing a disservice to his constituency. But in any case, that campaign in favor of Soviet Jewry led to about 1.5 million folk from that part of Europe migrating to Israel. That's not including those migrating from the former German Democratic Republic or Socialist Hungary, Socialist Poland, Bulgaria, etc. And they wind up bulwarking, augmenting the Jewish population of Israel in their demographic confrontation with the Palestinian Arab population. Although, interestingly enough, like US nationals and other nationals, they're fleeing helter-skelter from Israel as we speak because they know what time it is. And speaking of knowing what time it is, I think that one of the problems and crises that US imperialism faces is that this crisis in Israel-Palestine may be the trigger that accelerates the ongoing and incipient decline of US imperialism, creating a new world order. They keep telling us that China is the ball game, but yet they're bogged down in Ukraine. Now they're about to be bogged down in Israel. Meanwhile, President Putin will be breaking bread this week in China. And that is not good news for US imperialism. So once this realization begins to dawn, that is to say that these ham-fisted right-wing policies of Benjamin Netanyahu and his accomplices in the Israeli lobby have backfired spectacularly. That is to say, it's accelerating the decline of US imperialism, may, and I underline may, lead to a collapse of the Israeli state. Certainly, I think Benjamin Netanyahu politically is a dead man walking. It's said that Donald Trump has to win the election in order to avoid prison. Mr. Netanyahu has to win a war in order to avoid prison because he's facing corruption charges and has tried to clip the wings of the Israeli Supreme Court prior to this, which led to a crisis domestically in Israel, tens of thousands in the streets. Many of those who were reservists were saying they were not going to fight anymore for Israel as long as Mr. Netanyahu is in power. But in any case, the reservists are like the National Guard. They're weekend warriors. Even if they did not face this formidable challenge of urban warfare, people who were stocking grocery shelves and sitting in office cubicles as recently as 8 days ago are not necessarily primed and prone to be able to fight Hamas in the streets of Gaza. So in any case, once this crisis becomes apparent, not only the crisis in Israel, but the knock-on effects with regard to US imperialism, there are going to be bitter recriminations with regard to how the United States got into this fickle pickle, so to speak. You already begin to see some of this with the change in the discourse. You know, the discourse with regard to anti-Black racism articulated by the American Civil Liberties Union is that, you know, you fight bad speech with good speech. You know, you don't try to, quote, suppress speech. But no, not now. Not with regard to everybody getting on board in lockstep with regard to supporting the Israeli colonialists. You either support the Israeli colonialists or, as they like to say in other contexts, look forward to being canceled. And so you see that these Zionist millionaires and billionaires are putting pressure on Harvard University, where students have been doxxed. There was a truck going through the streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, just a few days ago with billboards with the pictures and details of pro-Palestinian students who now are being subjected to harassment. You have the president of the University of Pennsylvania, who, by the way, is a lawyer. She thought the line was the old ACLU line that, you know, you fight bad speech with good speech. But no. The folks are saying, no. What are you, a bigot? Whose side are you on? And so she's under pressure now. I'm not sure she'll be able to survive. You have law students who've had job offers withdrawn. There was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning by a professor of law at my law school alma mater at Berkeley saying, employers, don't hire some of my students because they're pro-Palestinian. I mean, who ever heard of a professor sandbagging his own students? So this is the moment we're in, leading to recriminations only 8 or 9 days into this conflict. Imagine what happens as this conflict proceeds. And then I expect recriminations ultimately leading to a crisis in the entire US ruling elite that could lead to a crackdown on certain pro-Zionist elements in the US ruling class. What I mean is that if you look at the career of a card-carrying member of the US ruling class, speaking of James A. Baker III, who is a leading figure in the Republican Party, former campaign manager for Ronald Wilson Reagan, former Secretary of the Treasury, former Secretary of State under the first George Bush. He tried to resolve this crisis during his tenure in Foggy Bottom. And for his troubles, the Zionist lobby sought to sandbag him, calling him a bigot and an anti-Semite, believe it or not. I mean, it takes quite a bit of arrogance or overconfidence to try to sandbag a man with the ruling class credentials of James A. Baker III. Now, some years ago, during one of these intermittent crises of capitalism in the United States, I had thought that the way the capitalist class was going to work its way out of this crisis was to punish pro-Zionist members of the ruling class. I'm thinking of the then imprisoned Michael Milken of Los Angeles, a billionaire, junk bond king. I'm thinking of Dennis Levine, Ivan Boesky. I may have been mistaken with regard to that supposition, but I do think it leads to a further supposition that certain members of the U.S. ruling class may not be as secure as they think they are, and that a reckoning is due with regard to how the United States arrived at this precarious moment. There's going to be finger pointing. There are going to be bitter accusations on all sides. And I understand retrospectively why so many Black intellectuals, organizations, leaders are hiding under their desks, other than those like Eric Adams and Hakeem Jeffries and Floyd Money Mayweather, the pugilists who trying to outdo Joseph Biden by sending a plane full of supplies to the Israeli expansionists, or Amari Stoudemire, the former Phoenix Sun and New York Knicks basketball player who became Jewish and now is attacking Black people who are not sufficiently pro-Israeli expansionists in his opinion. So I understand why that's happening, but I'm not sure if all in the Black community in particular, or even in the non-Black community for that matter, recognize these larger forces that I've been able to sketch. Because other than what I've already said, I don't find it coincidental. I'm not a coincidence theorist, by the way. I don't find it coincidental that there are crises in most of the major settler colonial societies extant. For example, in New Zealand, you just had a smashing victory by the Conservatives in reaction to the fact that the incumbent party had been accused of being too soft with regard to the indigenous Maori population. In neighboring Australia, a referendum that was designed to bring more rights to the indigenous population was soundly and roundly defeated, a slap in the face of the so-called non-European population. We have this crisis unfolding in the settler state that's Israel, crisis unfolding in the settler state known as the United States. We could spend the rest of the hour talking about that, starting with the clown show that is the U.S. House of Representatives and how the government may be shutting down in a few weeks, and how payments to soldiers may be jeopardized and payments to other workers may be jeopardized as a result. I don't find this coincidental, because just like you can make an argument that as we started at the top talking about the origins of the Zionist project and how it has been overtaken by events, that is to say, some of the left-wing forces who supported the creation of the state of Israel in 1947-48 would not necessarily be in the forefront of supporting Israeli expansionism. You have a new trend in the United States of describing the United States as a settler colonial society. Native American studies scholars are hammering that point home repeatedly. So there's an entire crisis of the settler colonial enterprise. And it's manifesting most dramatically in Israel-Palestine, but not exclusively, not solely in Israel-Palestine. And so these are some of the points that I think your audience needs to consider as they begin to try to figure out where we're headed.
Yes, of course, there was the ghastly debacle in the Canadian Parliament with with Nazi, which I think, it's not an accident that, that happening, I think, is directly related because if you think about Israel now, the issue of Nazis and the contradiction of imperialism, that an exclamation mark was placed upon with that. You know what I mean? Particularly now, if you could speak to the issue of that contradiction wherein a country, an empire that claims to be pro against anti-Semitism, all of these other things, and the contradiction of A, the ghastly debacle in the parliament, and B, the radio silence of the Biden administration. People all over the world spoke out against that. The Biden administration was quiet as can be.
Well, I think you can approach this from a number of different angles. One, in terms of this aforementioned revision of our understanding of settler colonialism, a term increasingly being used to describe the United States, a descriptor, if you like. This is a turnabout because historically, folks on the left have been in the forefront of this romanticized view of the founding of the United States, of the so-called vaunted Constitution. Of course, they had to engage in a lot of contortion ideologically in order to arrive at that point of view. I mean, for example, praising the so-called Bill of Rights, even though, as any second-year law student could tell you, from its origins in the late 18th century, it hardly applied in the States. That's a post-1865 phenomenon. And in any case, it didn't even apply to most of the population. Black people didn't have a Second Amendment right to bear arms. If we had, I guarantee you, slavery would have ended well before 1865. It was a strategic objective of the settlers to keep arms out of the hands of the indigenous population. And in any case where it was supposed to apply, which is in the 10-mile square of Washington, D.C. in the federal district, it didn't apply there either. So this was more like paper rights with hardly any teeth behind them. And yet our friends on the left, they're saluting the Bill of Rights as this great leap forward for humanity and trying to regale the unwitting with the alleged charms of so-called bourgeois democracy, which is ludicrous. But slowly but surely, that sort of nonsensical romanticism is disintegrating. And in its stead, to the point, is arriving this idea that in these settler colonial states, which are grounded in exclusivity, Jewish supremacy in historic Palestine, white supremacy in the United States, white supremacy in Australia. Australia is a quote, legally, unquote, white supremacist state until 1967, and only yielded because the United States wanted it as an ally and was embarrassed to have a white supremacist ally other than apartheid South Africa in its corner. So now many are beginning to throw the dust out of their eyes and recognize that in these settler colonial states in general, and in capitalist states more specifically, there is an inherent impulse towards fascism. That is to say, there is an inherent impulse by the rulers to try to repress the working class. We have the working class in the United States on the march right now with the strikes in Hollywood, strikes of United Auto Workers, UPS, Kaiser Permanente hospital workers. The capitalist class feels that they don't want to share their humongous slice of the pie. And so when the deal goes down, they're more than willing to drop the fascist hammer. And so, like many, I did not see that spectacle in Ottawa as coincidental or accidental when a standing ovation was given to a 98-year-old Nazi. Because we all knew that per Operation Paperclip, the United States, and particularly the Canadians, had been importing, if you like, Nazis as Berlin was collapsing in 1945. Werner von Braun, the German rocketeer who designed these rockets that rained down on London in circa 1940-41, forcing Londoners to sleep in subways to avoid the rockets. He winds up in Huntsville, Alabama, helping to develop the US rocket program. We all know that Chrystia Freeland, number 2 behind Justin Trudeau, comes from one of these families. She's done a cover-up with regard to her relatives of Ukrainian fascist background, who, by the way, benefited directly from expropriation of property of Jewish Europeans forced to flee, many of them executed unceremoniously. Before this debacle in Ottawa, it was thought that she could easily either replace Justin Trudeau as prime minister or even replace Jan Stoltenberg as the head of NATO. Now I'm not so sure. I would like to think that her career is in tatters, as they say in Brussels. But in any case, I think that the larger lesson that we're grasping is that these racially exclusivist states in origin rarely shed altogether their political and cultural DNA. And it begins to reassert itself at fraught moments. And therefore, when you had the spectacle in Ottawa, I think the Canadians were trying to see what they could get away with. Now, fortunately, there has been a backlash, at least in Canada, and certainly to a degree worldwide. But we should take that as a reminder. We should take that as a reminder that we should keep our powder dry. And certainly, any with lingering illusions about the romanticism of these settler colonial states, either they should make sure that their healthcare provider allows for therapy, or alternatively, they should engage in some serious self-study and political education.
Let me ask you, I think one of the issues going forward related to this, and this is just going to make this the issue more pronounced, is the European ruling elite. It seems to me that as a result of the Ukrainian conflict, it was obvious that the time is coming. If you look at what's happened in Slovakia, if you look at what happened recently to the ruling coalition in Germany in the local elections, they got pasted pretty well. The current ruling elites in Europe, in here also, but let's say Europe, their right to rule, their ability to rule, the acceptance of them as the ruling elite is in great danger. And I say that because as the ruling elite in Europe seek to prohibit any actions on behalf of the Palestinians, we see huge demonstrations, we see great pushback at the same time. And these two things are inextricably linked. At the same time, the neocon Ukraine project falls apart. And of course, it's inextricably linked because, the U.S. imperialism is going to say, hey, who cares about you? Who cares about the Ukrainians? We're done with them. We're going to move over to Israel. They're our priority. So the issue of the European working class, such as it is, suffering greatly as a result of the Ukrainian conflict and being told they have to do this to stand up for democracy against autocracy, and then their ruling elite just dropping it and saying we're going to Israel, something that's even less popular, Israeli imperialism, Israeli colonialism, that's even less popular in Europe than it is here. The issues of the working class, the ruling elite, upcoming elections in Europe. Dr. Horne.
Well, shame on me, because in going through that litany with regard to neo-fascist and fascist trends, somehow I did not mention the most flagrant example, speaking of Italy, where Prime Minister Meloni comes directly out of the party of Benito Mussolini, in some ways the founding father of fascism. Interestingly enough, when we speak about the fiasco in Ottawa, the standing ovation for a Nazi, we should group in that category the fact that just a few months ago, Prime Minister Meloni, a representative of fascism, was photographed holding hands with President Biden in the Oval Office. I don't think that Mr. Biden was reverting to his discredited habit of being handsy, as they say. I think that it was a representative of a kind of political simpatico between, sadly, Mr. Biden and Prime Minister Meloni. Now, I say sadly because, once again, the community that has the most to lose with regard to the rise of these neo-fascist trends A, they probably don't know who Maloney is. B, they didn't see the photograph. And C, even if they did see it, they might not be able to interpret it. I'm speaking of many of our friends in the Black community in particular, who have the most to lose. But what's happening in Europe right now should be a cautionary tale, but I'm not sure if the lessons will be learned. I mean, look at the Federal Republic of Germany right now. The locomotive of the European Union, 82 million strong, a country led by Chancellor Scholz, or sometimes called Sergeant Schultz, in reference to an old US sitcom with a bumbling Sergeant Schultz. Here you have this country that's occupied by US military forces, which gives the United States quite a bit of leverage in terms of internal German politics. It broke off relations with Russia at the behest of Uncle Sam, and then lost cheap energy from Russia, which was key to the German economic miracle, so-called, then had to revert to buying more expensive natural gas from, guess where, the United States of America. You have the Texas energy producers on the Louisiana-Texas border who are still dancing in the streets about that victory. If I could turn my camera, I could show you that they're dancing the streets of Texas to this very day about that coup that they pulled off. But the Germans also decided that they were going to buy energy from Qatar, the Gulf Arab monarchy, which is not only sponsoring Al Jazeera, which, by the way, has recovered spectacularly in terms of its coverage of the Palestinian crisis. I turned it off as a result of some of their flubs concerning Ukraine. Chancellor Scholz just met with the emir of Qatar, who warned him that unless they change their policy with regard to historic Palestine, you should either see a spectacular rise in natural gas exports from Qatar to Germany or cut off. So Germany is being squeezed. It's also because Uncle Sam has mandated it. It's being encouraged and enticed to break off relations with its major trading partners, speaking of the People's Republic of China. Now, Chancellor Scholz, to his credit, has balked at that. I mean, I guess he's saying, we may be a neo-colony, but I mean, we're not chumps. Recall that just some months ago, he took a plane load of businessmen with him to broker deals with China. But Germany is going through something that I'm afraid to say a number of North Atlantic countries might be going through. That is to say, deindustrialization, a great leap backwards. And this, in some ways, is consistent with the demented dreams of a section of the U.S. ruling class. Recall that John Bolton, in his memoir, the former national security advisor under Trump, said that Mr. Trump saw the European Union as second only to China as an antagonist of the United States of America. So naturally, a segment of the U.S. ruling class wants to bring Germany to its knees. There is a Columbia professor, Anu Bradford, wrote this book, which actually I recommended. It's called The Brussels Effect, How the European Union Rules the World. I know that sounds strange, but what she suggests is that because the EU has a population of 500 million, it can devise regulations that lock in Facebook, Meta, X, Twitter, regulations with regard to auto emissions. As a matter of fact, she analogizes Brussels to the capitalist economy as Sacramento is to the US economy. That is to say, Sacramento comes up with regulations for California, and auto companies then have to adhere to California regulations more so than having two sets of regulations, one for California and one for the rest of the United States. And so there are those in the US ruling class who want to bring the EU to its knees. The EU is cooperating. And interestingly enough, France, which more than most EU countries has sought to display a bit of backbone, has not done so with regard to this Palestine-Israel crisis, probably because it has a strong Zionist lobby all of its own. Recall that historically, the French ruling class has supplied sophisticated Mirage jets to the Israelis. Recall as well that France is not averse to getting in the face of the Turks, because the Turks, among other things, are pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian, for example. As a matter of fact, one outgrowth of this present crisis might be an attempt to oust Turkey from NATO, because Turkey is not necessarily in sync with other NATO members with regard to this full-throated support of Israeli settler colonialism. So these are part of the many problems that Europe is facing as we speak. I'm not sure if they'll be able to dig themselves out of this deep hole in which they find themselves. And once again, somehow, the ultimate beneficiary will be the People's Republic of China, which will just accelerate this ongoing trend. The ongoing trend being a new world order, the ongoing trend being China in the passing lane, the ongoing trend being the incipient decline of US imperialism.
The global South. Two things. They're particularly amongst the left, in which I'm more familiar with. My travels in South America have been, generally meeting with and doing journalism with people on the left, socialist parties, communist parties, etc. One thing I know that is brought into the conversation by them when you talk about Israel is that Israeli military, Israeli police have a history of training their physical oppressors. And so if we could talk about the global South now, additionally, you've got South Africa, which has taken a position, when it comes to the apartheid issue. You've got what's happened recently with the French in West Africa. So talk about the global South, Latin America, Africa, regarding and how they maybe view this. Your thoughts on the ties and what's going on with the global South, how they're connected into this this particular Middle East conflict with Israel and Palestine.
Well, first of all, as you probably know, President Petro in Bogota, Colombia, has been exchanging ever more heated words with the Israeli authorities because of the depredations they're inflicting as we speak against Palestinians. This slow motion genocide that we see unfolding on worldwide television, a horror that was hardly imaginable as recently as 10 days ago. Then you have President Maduro of Venezuela, who obviously has a bone to pick with US imperialism and its satraps, including Israel, because the way they tried to drive his economy into the ditch. And by the way, once again, returning to the Black community, you hear occasionally this upset with regard to people from Venezuela arriving in Chicago, arriving in New York. You don't hear as much comment about the root of the question, which are these punishing, pulverizing sanctions against Venezuela, for example, which helps to drive people away from Caracas. With regard to Brazil, as we speak, Brazil is in the forefront at the Security Council of the United Nations, trying to negotiate a resolution that hopefully could be used as a lever to lead to a ceasefire. And you may have seen the stories from the US State Department, which has recommended the US diplomats jettison from their vocabulary words like ceasefire, de-escalation, etc. In other words, as ever, US imperialism is playing a double game. On the one hand, you have Antony Blinken, Secretary of State, and Joseph R. Biden, President, speaking out of one side of their mouth, talking about we stand by Israel. Israel has not only a right, but an obligation to do what's necessary to defend itself. On the other hand, could you be more kind towards civilians? No, I mean, come on, man. Who do they think they're fooling? And so hopefully a resolution will emerge from the Security Council backed by China and Russia, even if US, Britain, and France are forced to veto. At least that will expose their moral nakedness before the world, with the international community drawing the appropriate conclusions. I also saw that in Lima, the Peruvian authorities were welcoming Peruvian citizens who were escaping from Israel. I knew that there were Thai nationals in Israel, Nepalese from Nepal, Eritreans, Ethiopians. Israel has gone South Africa one better, if you like, with regard to constructing an apartheid state, not only putting in a second-class position the original inhabitants, but then inviting in more people from Peru, from Thailand, from Nepal, from the four corners of the world. The so-called president of Peru, who you know is a beneficiary of a coup d'etat, was welcoming back Peruvians who were able to escape. And I've been heartened by the ever more stinging condemnations of Israeli policy emanating from the South African Foreign Ministry. South Africa, as you know, has one of the more affluent and significant Jewish communities worldwide. Recall that Abba Eban, who was a longtime Israeli foreign minister, actually had roots in apartheid South Africa. When apartheid South Africa was collaborating with apartheid Israel with regard to a nuclear bomb, Abba Eban was in the middle of that particular controversy, for example. So the global South, I think, has stood tall. And even more than that, I think that there are certain inferences we may want to draw with regard to that latter point. What I mean is, recall that right after October 7th, Mr. Biden was able to knock together a statement from the usual suspects, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, etc., backing Israel, blah, blah, blah. But then I wondered, where's Japan? Where's South Korea, for example? I thought that they were capitalist allies. During the Ukraine crisis, during the NATO meeting in Vilnius just a few months ago, there was all this talk about opening a NATO office in Northeast Asia, perhaps in Japan. I guess they lost track of geography. They don't realize that Northeast Asia is not the North Atlantic, but, why be picky? But in any case, I drew the inference that either A, they chose not to invite their erstwhile Asian allies to sign on to this statement, or B, they asked them and they declined because they have investments in Indonesia, where there have been raucous demonstrations in this most populous, predominantly Muslim country on planet Earth. They have interests in South Asia, raucous demonstrations in Pakistan, raucous demonstrations in Malaysia, a leader of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And so it's possible that the protests emanating from the global South are helping to keep erstwhile capitalist powers like Japan and South Korea in line, not wanting to get on their bad side. Once again, this does not bode well for US imperialism, for North Atlantic imperialism. It deepens their crisis. It obviously hands another victory to the People's Republic of China. As a matter of fact, if I were of a more conspiratorial bent, I might be forced to the conclusion that you got Chinese agents working overtime in the State Department. Now, I don't want to put that out because people might take it seriously. But what I mean is US policy and North Atlantic policy almost unavoidably seems to be benefiting the People's Republic of China. Now, that may just be because that's the current zeitgeist. That is to say that the objective conditions globally are pushing towards Chinese interests being in the passing lane and US interests receding. Whatever the case, once again, I think our theme for this evening needs to be reinforced, which is the incipient decline of US imperialism, and barnacles on that sinking ship include the Israeli settler colonialists and expansionists.
Let me ask you this, something I thought of, and I've brought it up with my friends here in the chat before. Israel's strength is Israel exists because they make an argument. This is an oasis for the Jewish people, right? That you live in wherever, Brooklyn, whatever, Rahway, New Jersey, you name it. And there's anti-Semitism there. People can hurt you. People can do terrible things to you. Come here. Your culture's here. It's all good here. You're going to be safe. When this incident first occurred, I noticed I saw a video of people absolute hordes heading for the airport.
Right.
And the airport was shut down. And I thought, that's interesting. They shut the airport down. The airport's not under attack. And I thought to myself, the end of Israel would be if your argument is this is a safe oasis. I've brought people. My brother recently passed away. He was a converted Jew. He was Jewish. He converted in the military to Jewish in the 1980s, and he had friends from the synagogue that would stop by his house. And many of them had Israeli citizenship. Some of their children had served in the IDF they were back and forth regularly. And I've noticed, had contact with some of them recently, and they're saying things like this. Well, my uncle got home last week. My other brothers, they're in such and such country. They're going this way to come home. All I'm hearing is, who's coming home? If Israel's argument that we're safe turns into, this is a place where there's rockets and missiles. Oh, by the way, if you're in the IDF, you're going to go fight Hamas in the rubble. And if you go north, we're at war with the Hezbollah. Everyone from Brooklyn and Severna Park and Annapolis, in this area where I live, they're going to be back here. There need not be a destruction of Israel if the argument that they make to worldwide, I guess Jewry would be the word, falls apart. And wisely, Jews around the world say, I think I'll stay in the country that I have citizenship with rather than go there because it ain't safe anymore. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, that's apparent. I think I raised that at the top. There's a contradiction. If you're going to create a Jewish state in order supposedly to protect the Jewish people, there's a flaw in that illogic, because by gathering them in one place, you make this minority more vulnerable. And you see that with regard to the planes taking off, coming back to the United States. You saw that Governor DeSantis greeted a plane full of people in Tampa the other day, where he made these absurd remarks that all people in Gaza are anti-Jewish, and so therefore none of them should be allowed in the United States. You see, I made reference to planes taking off from Peru, taking off for other places, and some of these are Jewish people, some of them are not Jewish people. The 1.5 million Russians who wound up in Israel as a result of that demagogic campaign around Soviet Jewry. Many of them are now trying to get back into Russia. But once again, not only does that idea of the Zionist project, and by the way, as you probably know, Zionism, its apparent popularity amongst Jewish Americans, for example, is a relatively recent vintage if you go back to the origins of Zionism in the late 19th century. And I understand that, because if you understand Jewish history, which many of these people don't, and by the way, you can look at the books I wrote on the 16th and 17th century for validation of the points I'm about to make. Part of the quote success unquote of the Jewish minority in the United States, which helps to undermine this idea of Jewish people being perpetually under threat, is that settler colonialism in North America under the Union Jack, under the British and English flag, historically involved a compromise with the Jewish diaspora. Britain or London had expelled this Jewish population at the end of the 13th century. By the 16th century, London was under the gun by the Spanish inquisitors, who of course had a policy that was anti-Jewish, pursuant to the Inquisition, that is to say, convert to Catholicism or die or be tortured. And London almost was overthrown by the Spanish monarch in 1588, and that accelerates this policy to try to embrace the Jewish diaspora, which leads to the construction of whiteness, this artificial identity. Strangely enough, many of those who consider themselves to be white are wholly and totally unfamiliar with this history, I guess because they would prefer to luxuriate and bathe in the privileges of this racial construction more so than understand it. But in any case, this is part of the, quote, secret, unquote, of the rise of the Anglosphere, this embrace of the Jewish community leading to this notion of a Judeo-Christian ethos and Judeo-Christian ethic. To be sure, there were bumps in the road. For example, there were allegations that I'll be talking about in a future book that Jewish folks close to the North Africans were enslaving British Christians as they were sailing south to try to enslave Africans. They'd be snatched in Algiers, for example, and then forced to be enslaved, and that led to a bout of anti-Semitism in the United States. You may be familiar with the case 100-odd years ago in Georgia, the Leo Frank case, where a Jewish man was lynched on the allegation that supposedly he was involved in blood libel, this longtime anti-Jewish forgery that certain Jewish people were killing Christians for, shall we say, bloody reasons. But despite those bumps in the road, I think it's fair to say that the reality of Jewish folk in the United States, the killing at the synagogue in Pittsburgh notwithstanding, and other bumps in the road, in some ways it belies this idea of Jewish people being perpetually on the verge of being liquidated. Now, what's interesting is that some of these same Zionists who have adopted what could only be called a politics of identity, after all, the state that they salute is based on an ethno-religious premise, an exclusivist premise. If that's not identity politics, I don't know what is. But yet, sometimes they put on their whiteness hat, which compels them to then defame Black people and even accuse, for example, Jesse Jackson of being a bigot, accusing Black people of being practitioners of identity politics, for example, when they don't even see it in themselves. So these are the parts of the contradictions that you see in the Zionist project in general. And I'm not sure if these contradictions will survive this current crisis in Israel-Palestine, where, to repeat, there is a distinct possibility that there could be an imminent collapse of this Israeli project, as suggested by the worldwide condemnation that is building against their genocidal policies in Gaza, but also because they took hundreds of thousands of people, reservists, weekend warriors, away from their role in the economy and put a gun in their hands and told them to go fight. Israel, if it's not careful, the best case scenario would be that it winds up like Ukraine, where the United States picks up the salaries and benefits of 150,000 Ukrainian civil servants. The United States Treasury might be forced to do that for Israel. But of course, we know that the United States itself is facing crisis, not only because of these antics in the House of Representatives. Look at the borrowing costs for the US government right now. Look at the continuing decline in purchases of US Treasury bills, which help to keep the US government afloat by the People's Bank in Beijing. Even Israel has been accused of hedging its bets by dumping some of its Treasury bills and accumulating in its foreign reserves more Chinese renminbi. So the United States, at the same time, it's supposedly trying to confront China, supposedly trying to confront Russia, but it has this brewing economic storm that could be of Category 5 hurricane velocity. And now it may be forced to pick up another economic basket case, speaking of a rapidly collapsing Israel.
Something else I wanted to ask you about. We're just about out of time, but I think it's important. We'll make this our last question. I recently read the statements by the Russian government, Sergei Lavrov, Vladimir Putin, in which they say, we've got to be measured here. And they say a couple of things. One, the problems in Israel are because the United States and the West failed over the course of years to take into account the Palestinian security needs and to come up with a fair and reasonable and just outcome. They also bring up that even in the beginning of Israel, the formation of Israel by the UN, that part of the agreement was the Palestinians would have their own state and homeland, et cetera. So they brought up the international law. Okay, so the Russians said that. And we saw a lot of people in the global South say, yeah, that sounds good. And China has come out with something similar. And there's talk now, the Chinese government speaking of the suffering of the Palestinian people, and they're saying the bombings, this must stop. And they're saying the same thing. Hey, the Palestinian people need their own homeland. They need a separate state, etc. So we hear Russia and China saying, we need to be balanced here. We need to act in accordance with international law. We need to take the Palestinian security needs into account. Contrasted against the U.S. imperialism, which just says this, the Palestinians aren't humans. Who cares about them? They're a bunch of animals. We've heard literally leaders in Israel refer to the Palestinians as animals. How at a time when the U.S. was trying to challenge China, we're going to build our own faux Belt and Road thingy going through the Middle East. We're having our summit for Africa. No, we've got to pull Africa away from China at a time when they're doing this. And China and Russia taking what would be considered a professional, a balanced approach that is in accordance with international law, taking into account the security needs of the Palestinians. How does that affect this whole, again, the global South and the whole competition, shall we say, among the great power competition? Let's just say that, Dr. Horne.
Well, it was under the first George H.W. Bush that he announced 30-odd years ago, the United States had more will than wallet. With this crisis in terms of borrowing costs for the United States government, the dumping of treasury bills by forces far and wide, this more will than wallet trope will be more real than ever. I should also say that challenge to the Belt and Road Initiative, which, by the way, they're marking the 10th anniversary in Beijing as we speak. That's one of the reasons why Mr. Putin is in Beijing this week. This announcement of this Saudi, Haifa, I think Mumbai, India road that then somehow would lead into Turkey. The United States was not necessarily contributing to that. I mean, it's like me coming up with great ideas for how you should spend your money. I'm sure you would say, well, Professor Horne, I think I have an idea of how I should spend my money. I don't need you to tell me. And once again, the problem for U.S. imperialism right now is that U.S. imperialism has overdetermined the military. That's why there are hundreds of U.S. military bases all over the world, including in nations like Germany. That's why there's a flotilla off the coast of Israel as we speak, with the U.S. authorities, you should suspect, are thirsting to bomb Iran. Bomb Iran, as the late Senator McCain once put it. But the problem there is that, that's flotilla. They're like sitting ducks. Recall the USS Cole, which was a couple guys in speedboats off the coast of Yemen, basically were able to wound that U.S. vessel severely. And so I'm not sure if these U.S. authorities have thought through their overdetermination of the military. Perhaps the military industrial complex and the strength of Lockheed Martin and Boeing are so formidable that they are obligated to seize a chunk of our tax dollars and put it in their pockets, making it difficult for the United States to adjust and adapt accordingly to new realities. But in any case, to return where we began, this crisis in Israel, Palestine is not going away anytime soon. Watch very carefully to see if Israel is actually planning an urban warfare campaign in Gaza City, confronting snipers and booby traps and minefields and drones dropping explosives, or if they're just faking the funk. And in any case, we know that the fighters are heavily underground. Let's see if these so-called bunker busting bombs that the United States boasts about are as potent as we are told they are. Let's see if the Moabs, the mother of all bombs, is as potent as US imperialism says these Moabs are. But I dare say that it's quite dangerous for a bully to be casualty averse, speaking of Israel, and it's quite dangerous indeed for a leading imperialist power, speaking of the United States, to have a losing track record in Afghanistan and other places too numerous to mention, and therefore can be justifiably accused of bluffing and having, as they say in Texas, all hat, no cattle.
Dr. Horne, let me ask you this. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Qatar, interestingly, you mentioned them earlier. Qatar, and I suspected this discussion would begin to arise at some point. There is ample evidence that the royal family of Qatar have made comments indicating that if they are sufficiently angered by an invasion, by a ground invasion or some act by Israel, that they would consider taking the move that we saw in the 1970s by, as they said, cutting off gas to the world, right? And the Muslim nations, many of these leaders of these countries have a tenuous grip on power. They know that they are not well liked, they don't well represent their population, and that their population is rabidly angry. And, you know, it kind of like someone holding back a German shepherd and he's pawing and panting in the air to get after his quarry, right? That's how these people, if they're trying to get to the Israeli border so they can pick up a rock or a slingshot or anything they can. The idea of the issue that some of these leaders in the Muslim world have that have been, you know, proxies for the US at the expense of their populations, and the push they may get to exercise that option to say we're going to cut gas off. Some of these countries they could be overthrown. Your thoughts about the peril that is placed upon the ruling elite, oftentimes, you know, monarchs in the Middle East, by the fact that the people of the Middle East so overwhelmingly and powerfully support the Palestinians. Your thoughts on that? That will make that the final question, but I think that's a very important issue.
Well, look at Egypt to begin with. You know that General al-Sisi, the leader, he came to power overthrowing Mr. Morsi, a leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a cousin of Hamas in Gaza, for example. That has made it possible for Cairo to cooperate with the Israeli authorities, even with regard, perhaps to this latest harebrained scheme of deporting Gazans to the Sinai, which was once under Israeli jurisdiction, then turned back over to the Egyptians. General al-Sisi has announced an election coming forth. Conveniently, he's been repressing the opposition, making it unlikely that there will be a stiffer challenge to him. But how he performs with regard to Gaza could upset his chessboard altogether, since there is, as you suggest, so much sympathy in the streets of Cairo for their brothers and sisters in Gaza. And pay attention to what happened on October 9th in Alexandria, Egypt, where an Egyptian police officer shot two Israeli tourists willy-nilly, for example. This is 2 days after the Hamas attack on Israel itself. Now, I'm old enough to remember the 1973 war, for example, where you had the exporting energy countries began to curtail shipments to the United States of America. There were cars lined up for miles at gas stations. You saw people pushing cars because they had run out of gas. We should not necessarily rule out that possibility. Certainly, you see that Saudi Arabia, the major producer, has been cooperating with Russia, contrary to the interests of Biden and the White House. You know that China brokered an entente between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that in the course of this crisis, you've had high-level discussions between the Iranians and the Saudis, oftentimes before the Chinese entente at each other's throats. The Iranians have said that they will not sit idly by as Palestinians are massacred. Intermittently, there have been rockets shot from southern Lebanon into northern Israel by Hezbollah, which fought the Israeli authorities to a standstill in 2006. There have been tens of thousands marching in the streets of Baghdad. Turkey, as it is called sometimes, as noted, has been a stalwart supporter of Hamas. And you might recall that some years ago, President Erdogan almost got in a fist fight on a platform in a public meeting with one of the Israeli leaders because he was so insulted and disturbed by their depredations in historic Palestine. I say all this to say, once again, that the Zionist lobby and their plaything in Israel has helped to paint U.S. imperialism into a corner from which it may not be able to escape. Certainly, it compromises their ability to confront China, the big enchilada, we're told. And as that reality becomes ever clearer, there's going to be hell to pay. I think, as noted, we see in the short term, there's going to be a purge and crackdown on progressive forces in the United States. But in the long term, I think that there's going to be a purge and crackdown within the U.S. ruling class as a whole. It's going to be like musical chairs. And some of these so-called millionaires and billionaires are going to find that they have no place to sit. And that will be a timbalor, if not an earthquake, in terms of the political economy of world imperialism.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, he's a historian, and he is a researcher. He's a author of upwards of 30 books and a great friend of the show. Dr. Horne, I really appreciate you taking your time out, sharing. You know, it's always incredible. I learn so much when we talk, and our viewers, all 854 currently, certainly appreciate that. I ask everyone to hit the like button. Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you very much. Certainly appreciate you coming on, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you for inviting me.
All righty. Well, everyone, what I'm going to do now is I will go through the super chats. I want to see, there's been questions asked, and I will look at the questions. We'll take some time here. Wow, a lot of people. And we'll see if we can answer some of these questions. It will take 10 minutes or so. I don't know how long we can go because there's a lot of them. So let us look. We got a super sticker. Thank you very much from Lucia. There's always some great questions. How about we go with Fadista? Thank you for this important discussion. Please keep this on the front burner. Everyone, please remember, I'm not on Twitter, so share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you, Sherry. We're going to keep going. Next, we're going to go to Jonathan Soul. Will Hezbollah get involved? Will conflict expand beyond Palestine? I have a friend in the area who said they believe that Hezbollah will get involved and the conflict will expand beyond Palestine. We shall see. That they believe that we're a day or so from that. Whether that happens, that remains to be seen. But I know someone who lives in Beirut who is a journalist who is very familiar with the situation, who that's the position that they've taken. So I don't know. I think that's it. I'm going to look. I don't see anything else in the way of super chats. Let's see. I think that's it. Does anyone else? We'll go to the very bottom. Okay. JM says, thank you both. I'm going to keep going. I don't see. Okay, let's go over to Rockfin. Okay, Rockfin. K. Korim says, an oil embargo was the likely play here from the start. Instead of the U.S. action of forcing Russia's hand to drive up oil prices, now it'll be the irrational Arabs that will drive prices because of Israel. Yeah, I do. That's what I felt for a while. I feel that some kind of an oil embargo will be eventually the play that the Arab leaders will make. I mean, it's their hand. It's a powerful hand. And let's face it, they could wipe out, the derivatives market. The derivatives are what? Insurance. So you have all of these people, the energy futures, oil futures market, right? Oil futures, they're betting in their investments on the future performance, or they're locking in prices for a period of time. This is all about the future. And what are derivatives or credit default swaps? What is this? They're taking out insurance. I invest $10 billion and I take out insurance so that if my investments don't work out, my insurance company pays me that $10 billion, right? But what happens if the entire oil futures market collapses because the countries in the Middle East say we're going to cut the oil down to a trickle at best, just enough. You have to keep a lot of these oil fields pumping, and they say we're going to sell just the minimum amount we have to keep our oil pumping, but that's it. As soon as that announcement would be made, the price would go through the roof. The losses would be massive for the oil speculators. And of course, the derivatives, the insurance companies would not be able to pay everyone off. The collapse of, unthinkable number of trillions, of 30 trillion, 60 trillion. I can't even imagine the number. That would be, the U.S. would not be able to print the money to pay that one off. And then it's game, set, and match. So this is very dangerous for for Wall Street. This is very dangerous for the speculators. So this is and I think that is something that could also have an effect on Israel's decision to go in. Whether or not Israel has that decision to make is another question. But they make that decision to go in, and they send their soldiers into a meat grinder. They're going to get the losses would be unthinkable, and of course the reaction if they go in from the other Muslim nations. It would be kind of suicide for Israel, because at the other part of it, I don't think these nations would forgive and forget. If they were the people on the street anyway, if the Israelis were to go in, kill a lot of more, and have some continue the bombing as they're doing, at some point, no Israeli would be able to walk the street anywhere in the Middle East, and some other places would be very dangerous for them. And it would end up being the opposite. It would be the opposite of what Israel argued. We're going to be safe. This is a safe place. This is oasis for world Jews around the world. They could create a dynamic where Jews around the world are unsafe because of the actions of Israel. So that's something we certainly don't want to see. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Don't forget, there's numerous ways if you can afford to help the channel, be it Patreon. Buy Me a Coffee is very, very easy. PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee. You just click on it and it says, buy Arlen a coffee, $5. And then it'll say how many coffees you want to buy, blah, blah, blah. And of course, you can do just like Patreon now with Buy Me a Coffee. And you can do monthly subscribers kind of thing for whatever amount you want. So that's certainly an option. Thanks a lot, everybody. Have a great day. Long day for me between doing all my radio shows and this stuff, but I've really enjoyed it. And it's just an incredible and very fortunate opportunity to be able to talk to a man of the stature and ability of Dr. Gerald Horne. Thanks. I'm out.